Right, welcome back to the online causal inference seminar. Today, we're extremely excited to have Tchetgen Tchetgen from the University of Pennsylvania, who will talk about revisiting identification in the binary instrumental variable model, the NATE and beyond. Questions today will be handled by Ying. And one quick comment about the format. So today, we don't have a discussion. So instead, what we're going to do is first, Eric is going to give his talk, and after that, we'll make it an open discussion. So if you have any questions, raise your hand and we'll promote you and you'll be able to talk to Eric. Yeah, with that, Ying, do you want to quickly say how you handle Q&A?
Sure. So as usual, please submit your questions in the Q&A section. For us to track them more easily, it's at the bottom of the Zoom window. And Eric will have some stopping points and we will raise some questions to him at that time, and we encourage you to submit your questions as soon as you have them, instead of waiting for us to ask you to submit. So without further ado, Eric, please feel free to pick your turn.
Okay, my slides up.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to thank Dominic, Ying, and Aditya and the rest of the organizing committee for inviting me to present here today. I have to take the blame for there not being a discussion because I literally finished my slides 10 minutes ago. It would have been hard to find someone to discuss them. And so my goal here today is basically revisit the canonical binary instrumental variable model, a central model in causal inference. And to review some existing results, but also to discuss some new identification results. This is work by many people, a lot of trainees and some colleagues, and there are multiple papers that will be discussed, some of which are published, some of which are in progress. And so I'll try to refer to the various contributions, and I will acknowledge everyone involved towards the end of the talk. So let me just get started. Here's a quick outline of the talk. As I mentioned, I'll review canonical. This is meant to be basically a conceptual talk. There is very little statistics per se. It's about identification strategies and thinking through reasoning about identification conditions in the IV model. So I'll review some existing literature on the local average treatment effect, the average treatment effect on the treated, and average treatment effect in the entire population, and then some new results on what we call the nudge average treatment effect, some new conditions for identification of the average treatment effect in the treated, and then some new results for what we call quasi-instrumental variables. So those are instrumental variables that may not satisfy the exclusion restriction, but you can still get nonparametric identification of a causal effect, and close with some conclusions. And basically, each time I complete one of these sections, I'll pause for questions. All right, so I don't have to say this to this audience. We care a lot about determining the causal effect of point exposure, sometimes standard exposures. Today, I'll focus on binary point exposure and binary IV. Ideally, we would love to conduct a randomized study, and that remains the gold standard for evaluation of causal effects. Practically speaking, and sometimes for ethical reasons, we resort to observational studies. And the main challenge, of course, to drawing inferences from observational data stems from concerns about confounding by hidden factors. Such confounding can obviously compromise the credibility of our studies. Even in randomized trials where confounding arises because of non-compliance, where individuals may choose for reasons unknown to the investigator not to adhere to the assigned treatment. Confounding bias is a major concern for evaluating causal effects of exposures in both observational studies and randomized trials with imperfect compliance. And therefore, the development of methods to adequately address this issue remains very much a priority for several disciplines in biostatistics, in epidemiology, in econometrics, in sociology, so on and so forth. IV methods are more popular than ever. And the way people use IV methods in practice is traditionally very, very simple procedures. And one particular strand of the literature has been, well, if you use such simple procedures such as two-stage least squares, when do you get something that could be interpreted as a causal effect parameter. So that's kind of the underlying motivation for today's talk is really going back and revisiting that central question that many have carefully studied over the years. And surprisingly, even though it's just a binary IV model, there's still a lot to be said about it. So the IV approach refers to a particular set of methods that allow one to recover, under certain assumptions, the causal effect of an exposure in the presence of unmeasured confounding. The IV approach has a long-standing tradition in econometrics, going back to the original work of Wright and Goldberger, who initially developed the approach in the context of linear structure equation modeling. More recently, these ideas have been formalized using potential outcomes or counterfactual variables, and that's going to be sort of the formulation I'm going to take. This was done by Imbens and Engres, Robbins, Engres, Imbens, and Rubin, and Heckman, using slightly different modes of identification, but nevertheless, kind of starting this literature of how do we think kind of factually about the effects in the IV context and formalizing identification conditions using such language. The key contribution of the counterfactual language to the IV approach is that it allows one to formally define the causal effect of interest and to articulate and reason about the assumptions needed to identify this effect. Fundamental to all IV methods is the key assumption that one has observed a pre-exposure variable, which I describe here as Z, unconfounded, known to satisfy the exclusion restriction, that the IV affects the outcome only. Can you see my cursor, by the way? Yeah, okay. All right. So I'm going to keep doing that. Then that the IV affects the outcome only through the exposure in view. So Z only affects Y, Z being the IV, A the exposure interest, and Y the outcome. And this is a DAG representation of the canonical IV model. I'm going to suppress measured covariates throughout the presentation and just mention them briefly at the end. As I said, this is primarily about identification. If you have covariates, you can leverage them by simply incorporating them in every single step of what I'm going to discuss today. There's some subtlety for inference, and particularly when you have covariates, you might think about robustness of how to incorporate those covariates. I'm not going to talk about it today. There's a very rich literature that I'm happy if people are interested to point in that direction. A variable satisfying this DAG structure, such a variable Z, can be hard to find, and people have become very creative in trying to find so-called quasi-experimental designs within observational studies. Economists are very adept at this, ethnologists have become increasingly more adept at this, and that's true about many social sciences as well. Okay, so once you find a valid IV, if you could identify one, it may be used to reduce the evidentiary gap between observational and experimental study designs. And there are various things that people can do. They can test for a causal effect by just looking at the relationship between Z and Y. They can use the structure in this DAG to construct bounds, or they can go all the way and try to get point identification. I'm going to start with point identification, and that's mainly going to be what I'm going to focus on. So here are some examples of IVs. So this is an cluster randomized trial. This was a randomized RCT trying to answer the question, does moving from high poverty public housing developments benefit the health of mothers and their children? A was a randomized experiment, a moving to opportunity study where the Z is the families being randomized to receive a voucher to alleviate the cost of moving from high poverty to low poverty neighborhoods versus no voucher. The treatment is whether or not the family relocated to a low poverty neighborhood. And the outcome in this case we were interested in was psychological distress of the kids measured after 10 years of follow-up. Not all families that were given a voucher decided to move. There was non-compliance. Some families who were not given a voucher eventually moved out of high poverty to low poverty neighborhood. And so there is non-compliance. The decision to move A here to uptake the intervention was not randomized. It is not randomized, and therefore one cannot rule out with certainty that there would be no unmeasured confounder U for the effect of moving from high poverty to low poverty on psychological distress of the children, for instance, after 10 years. For epidemiologists, a popular, very highly popular study design nowadays is so-called Mendelian randomization studies to look at the causal effect of certain phenotypes. So the idea here is to use randomized genotypes as IVs to estimate the causal effect of phenotypes influenced by those genotypes. For example, the exposure might be BMI, Y, depressive symptoms, or other mental disorder. And a popular SNP in this case would be the FTO genetic variant. But now there are well over 100 candidate SNPs that might be causal for, that I believe to be causal for BMI. And so people will try to leverage that sort of genetic randomization to learn about the effect of phenotype on the outcome. This is a fairly controversial setting, and I'll come back to this later on when I talk about quasi-instrumental variable. And that's basically because while the randomization of Z is undisputed in general and can readily be accounted for, can account for population stratification, that's a source of why Z might be correlated with Y. The exclusion restriction is highly questionable in many of these applications, so there might be a direct effect from Z to Y. And MR has been maybe the one area where quasi-instrument have been very much in at the forehead of their thinking and trying to think about strategies to account for possible violation of exclusion restriction. And I'll come back to this later on in the talk. In any case, this is another area where maybe one of the fastest growing applications of IV in epidemiology is in MR studies. There are other examples that people have come up with. I'm just going to list them here and not really discuss them so that I can get to the actual meat of the presentation. So in today's talk, well, I'm going to focus on very simple canonical setting of a binary treatment and a binding instrument, in which case the most common empirical quantity computed is the so-called Wald Ratio estimate, which is given here. And I'll use this WR to denote the Wald Ratio. And it's basically quantifying the effect of Z on Y divided by the effect of Z on A. And that's given here in terms of expectation. The effect of Z on Y is typically referred to as the reduced form, the effect of Z on A as the first stage. It's visualized in this DAG. In the randomized experiment setting, Z would be randomized treatment, A would be uptake of treatment, and the Wald ratio could be written as essentially the intent to treat effect corrected by the effect of randomization of compliance. You can easily see that if you have perfect compliance, therefore probability of A equals 1 given Z equals 1 is 1. Probability of A equals 1 given Z equals 0 is 0. And of course, the Wald ratio, as it should, collapses to the intent to treat analysis, regressing, or the reduced form, regressing Y and Z. One question, and so that's kind of the logic for using some people advocating for running an intent to treat analysis if you wanted to test for a causal effect. Now, suppose you do find one, the question is, how do you interpret this Wald ratio estimate? What is the causal interpretation? And you want to do so without reliance on parametric models, such as assuming that the world is linear and so on. The assumptions encoded in the causal DAG are not enough to identify a causal effect. The interpretation of the Wald estimate depends on what additional assumption you layer on the graph, and that's sort of the topic for today. Before I get into those extra assumptions, let's just reinterpret the DAG. The IV DAG encodes 3 assumptions. I'm going to refer to them as IV1 through IV3. IV1 is that Z and the IV and the exposure are associated. And there are various versions of this, either that Z is a causal effect of A, and that's needed for the late and the late, which I'll introduce in a little bit, or Z and A share common causes, so Z can be confounded, the effect of Z on A can be confounded. And that's will still allow for identification of the ATT and the AT, provided you have a valid IV. Not otherwise valid IV. I'm not really going to dwell on these distinctions. For the rest of the talk, I'm just going to assume that you have a valid a causal IV. And this brings up some subtleties that I'm not particularly interested in discussing today in terms of the different estimates. I sort of want to find the simplest possible framework to make the points that I want to make. Assumption IV2 that Z does not share common causes with the outcome. There's no unmeasured confounding of the effect of the IV on the outcome. Assumption IV3 that Z affects the outcome only through A. There is no direct effect of Z on Y other than through A. This is known as the exclusion restriction, and I'll refer to it as such. We'll use potential outcomes or counterfactuals. Let AZ denote the counterfactual treatment under an hypothetical IV value Z, little z. Imbens and Angris in the 94 paper introduced 4 types of individuals. We will refer to these as compliance types. Never takers, values NT, with A0 equals 0 and A1 equals 0. They will never take the treatment regardless of which IV value they are set to. Always takers, they would always take the treatment regardless of which value they were set to. The IV was set to. Defiers, they would only take the opposite treatment of the value that they were set to, and compliers, they will follow what you ask them to do. So A0 equals 0, A1 equals 1. The treatment optic will always agree with the assigned IV value. And so as such, we'll define a compliance type random variable C that takes one of these 4 values, and is of course mutually exclusive. This accounts for the entire sample space of compliance types. We'll likewise use potential outcomes for the outcome. YAZ will denote the potential outcome under an intervention that sets A to little a and Z to little z. Throughout, we'll make the standard consistency assumption. I will not revisit this. And we'll interpret IV1 mathematically as basically conditional on the unmeasured confounder. There is an association between Z and A, almost surely. IV2 as this ignorability condition, latent ignorability condition, that if I had condition on U, it would render the potential outcome YAZ independent of the IVZ, but also the potential treatment value AZ and A is equals 0 and AZ equals 1. This is stronger than what we actually need, but this will be convenient as a common background for all the various strategies I'm going to discuss without getting into subtleties of how one might weaken one assumptions versus the other. And then also the IV independence assumption that U is independent of Z. And then finally, IV3 is an exclusion restriction that Z does not cause Y other than through A. So these are the 3 standard IV assumptions. This is the manner in which we're going to interpret the DAG. Okay, the IV DAG. And then we're now going to go through various 4th assumptions that leads to identification. One that's particularly popular in econometrics and social sciences is the so-called no-defiers assumption that, in fact, the probability that C is equal to compliance type is the defier, giving you a 0 almost surely. This assumption is also known as a Montefiore assumption, as indicated here, that the probability that A0 is less or equal to A1 giving you is 1 almost everywhere. The assumption says that there is no individual in the population for whom who would be exposed under Z equals 0, but would be unexposed under Z equals 1. In the context of a randomized experiment, this will be a person who would do the exact opposite of what he or she is told to do, and that's the name defier. And so, oops. Under assumptions IV1 through IV3, which is the IV DAG, and this 4th assumption of monotonicity, Imbens and Angris showed that the Wald ratio identifies the compliers average causal effect, which is given here. This is the average causal effect for compliers, another name for the late. Angris and Imbens, Nobel Prize in Economics, a couple of years ago, partly cited this result as one of the reasons why they received their well-deserved award. And so this is kind of very acclaimed, highly acclaimed result that sort of revolutionized how people thought about IVs before, and as a non-parametric quantity. In the context of a randomized trial, this is the causal effect for individuals who would adhere to their assignment. And so that's a very appealing interpretation. In the MTO study, that would be the causal effect experienced by families who would move if given a voucher, but not otherwise. All right, so that's our first review of the late. Second review is about identifying the ATT, again under the IV DAG, and now we will visit a different fourth assumption. This is in a separate standard of work. Robinson 94 formulates the IV approach using counterfactuals to define the average effect of treatment on the treated. He shows that this effect is identified assuming no heterogeneity with respect to the IV in a structural mean model, which he calls the no current treatment value interaction assumption. This approach has further been developed under similar identifying assumption using multiplicative and logistic link function, but we'll stick to just the additive model today. Why is this not? Oh, there you go. And so in addition to IV1 through IV3, Robbins introduced this fourth assumption of no current treatment value interaction, which simply says that the causal effect among the treated for those who were assigned to receive treatment agrees with the causal effect among the treated for those who were assigned to the control arm. Under these assumptions, IV1 through IV3 and this IV4 star assumption, the IV DAG and no current treatment value interaction, Robbins shows that in fact the Wald ratio now can be interpreted as the effect of treatment on the treated. Okay, that's our second identification result. The effect of treatment on the treated does have a long tradition in epidemiology. It's sometimes only relevant, the only relevant effect, that is the effect experienced by individuals who actually were exposed. In the case of a harmful exposure, this is the estimand that in a judicial court setting, the court would care about. The advantage of the approach is that it does not require the Monteith assumption. In fact, the relation between Z and A can be increasing for some individuals and decreasing for others. It doesn't affect the interpretation. But the approach requires ruling out the possibility of effect heterogeneity on the effect of A, in the treated, which is kind of seems somewhat restricted because that's the effect we're actually interested in. And so we're ruling out certain kind of causal effects that we are actually trying to learn from the data. However, it's actually possible to reason about an underlying structural model that might imply this no interaction assumption. It is trivial to see that this no additive interaction assumption, the no current treatment value interaction, is implied by the following structural model. If you were to condition on U among the treated, the potential outcome Y little a follows this model that's additive and rules out any additive interaction between U and A. This is a sufficient but not necessary condition. It's easy to reason about that this is actually what you might be assuming, but this is also still very stringent because it rules out any interaction between what you're concerned about, which is latent confounding and the treatment of interest. Fortunately, there's a very little known result that's buried in the appendix of the Hernan and Robbins paper. And I rediscovered this result, and I was, like most of the things that I've done, solely disappointed when I found out that Jamie had thought about it 20 years before I did. But nevertheless, I was quite pleased to see this, and this is not often cited as a really good generative model for the no interaction assumption. So in this appendix of Hernan and Robbins in 2006, they showed that in fact, there's no current additive interaction model is implied by IV1 through IV3, and IV4 dagger assumption that only imposes a restriction in the treatment model to be a multiplicative treatment assignment mechanism. That is, the probability that A is equal to 1 given U and Z is multiplicative in Z and U. This model essentially rules out a multiplicative interaction between Z and U in causing A. In slight abuse of language, we'll refer to this as a multiplicative IV model. And so this is quite nice because it liberates the outcome model again to be free. And similar to monotonicity, it only restricts the degree of heterogeneity in the first stage, in the propensity score, given the unmeasured confounders. So it has the same kind of appeal that we are agnostic as to the outcome model, but make a judgment about how the treatment might have been assigned. Therefore, IV1 through IV4 dagger actually does imply identification of the ATT. And I think this actually provides much more solid grounding to identification of the ATT in terms of treatment optic decision, as opposed to restricting the outcome model. All right, so let's move on to our third final review before we move into the new results. This is concerning the average treatment effect. So we'll consider IV IV-, this is a new IV4 assumption, which requires only one of the following. The first one, which is very similar to the one that I just discussed under a structural additive model for the counterfactual outcome, that the causal effect conditional on levels of U that's actually is constant in U. So there's no later heterogeneity of the ATE. And this is, as we already said, maybe an undesirable assumption one may want to make, given that this is the target of inference. Or B, that the additive effect of Z on the treatment does not depend on U. So this is, again, a no interaction assumption similar to the multiplicative model, but now on the additive scale for the treatment. So no unmeasured confounder of the effect of A on Y that predicts compliance type, essentially, is one way you might consider thinking of this. Then in a paper back in 2018 with Limbo Wang, we showed that under assumptions IV1 through IV3, so you have a valid IV, and now this IV4 assumption of no additive interaction in the first stage, the population average treatment effect is nonparametric identified by the IV estimand, the Wald ratio. And so what's really cool about this is that you compute one number, the Wald ratio, and this is just about reasoning about treatment uptake. Is it monotone at the individual level? Is it additive or is it multiplicative? Okay, of course, I mean, this is the point of this is basically providing a framework under which you might be able to interpret that one number. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're thinking of that assumption that it holds, but this would allow for a researcher at the very least to come up with a meaningful interpretation for the causal effect they are targeting. And also to anchor any kind of sensitivity analysis you might want to do. And I'll come back to this later on about the nature of the fourth assumption. So the result under IV4-A is not entirely surprising. So that was this first one, where you assume homogeneity of the causal effect in U, because it literally states that the causal effect is constant. Therefore, you would recover the average treatment effect for the whole population. The result in the IV4-B is somewhat surprising, and is there's not placed any restriction on the level or nature of heterogeneity of the causal effect of A on Y. It only restricts the first state relation such that the mechanism of ZA is independent of that from UA. The condition can actually be restated in a weaker form of what's known as no common effect modifier. And this basically says that the heterogeneity in the causal effect in the outcome scale and the heterogeneity in the first stage are uncorrelated, are orthogonal to each other. And in fact, this is much weaker than assuming either A or B, in the sense that you could have heterogeneity at both levels, but it could also be a heterogeneity with respect to unmeasured factors that are independent. And that's the case that was not covered by either A or B. So what do we have so far? And then I'll do this and then I'll stop for questions if there are any questions. So we have the Wald ratio, one number, one statistic that anyone can compute. And it has different interpretation under the IV DAG, assumptions IV1 to IV3. And depending on which fourth assumption you make, whether there's monotonicity, the Wald ratio then can be interpreted as a late, whether it's IV4 star, of no current treatment value interaction, then the Wald ratio is the ATT, or whether it's the no current treatment value interaction is motivated by a multiplicative IV model for the first stage, in which case, again, the Wald ratio is the ATT. And finally, no common effect modifier assumption IV4-, then the Wald ratio can be interpreted as the AT. The important advantage is that one computes a single number, different interpretation obtained depending on the nature of heterogeneity in treatment assignment mechanism. Which model is more credible is in the eye of the investigator. Each requires strong substantive, none is necessarily weaker than the other. All right, let me pause there maybe to see if there are any questions.
Eric, thank you for asking. We have a question asking when are assumptions IV4 and IV4 star equivalent so that you can use any of the two?
That's a good question. So if in the case of a randomized trial, I'll give you one example. I'm sure there are many others. In the case of a randomized trial, if the control arm is excluded from the treatment, so if you like take COVID vaccine, where you have to complete a series of shots to be compliant, but the vaccine is only available in the trial. so no one can go out there and get the vaccine, then monotonicity holds by design. And it's also true that the ATT in the randomized arm, z equals 1 arm, is identified. So you automatically get that number, that one number satisfying both. And so that would be one instance. There are other instances. If you think of monotonicity has been shown by Vitakil to be equivalent to a latent index model, a certain latent index model. Under various forms of latent index model, you can actually find common grounds for generating a treatment or a compliance type that is compatible with both IV4 and IV4 star. Maybe I'll stop there. There are other instances where you might be able to generate concurrence between the two assumptions.
Thank you so much for the answer.
Thank you for the question. All right, so what's new? So throughout, we're going to define an individual as being nudge able, or a unit as being nudge able, if a unit whose treatment selection is prone to change in response to a nudge induced by the instrument, irrespective of whether the specific nudge induces a compliant or defined treatment uptake behavior. So I'm not going to make a distinction between a compliance and defined. And in fact, there is something that I struggle very much with. There seem to be something, there's a connotation that a person who follows agrees with the value of the instrument is compliant. But in many applications, such as in MR, where the IV, the ordering doesn't necessarily have a judgment attached to it, the fact that your exposure responds to a nudge of the IV, whether it's you being classically known as a compliant defined, doesn't really matter. It's the fact that it's not, the nudge works, generates a treatment variation that's exogenous. It's what we care about. And so for a long time, I tried to think about, well, okay, if I start with that premise that in some application, there is no judgment attached to being a compliant or defined, all I care about is the effect that could be recovered by a nudge of an exogenous nudge of the treatment by an IV. Under what condition would the Wald ratio have a meaningful interpretation? And so I'm going to present one set of such sufficient conditions here today. Formally, let N be the nudge-able individuals. So those are individuals for whom AZ equals 1 does not agree with AZ equals 0. So either compliers or defiers. Then the nudge average treatment effect will be the average treatment effect among the nudge-able individuals. Okay? We'll now consider identification of this need. To state the identification result, we'll again consider two kinds of source of heterogeneity, one being in the causal effect among the nudge-able. And so this, I'm writing the conditional average treatment effect given that you're nudge-able for that subpopulation and your unmeasured confounding U, we'll call that delta YU. And we'll also consider the probability of being a complier, so the compliance share, among the nudge-able, so individuals who would either be compliers or defiers as a function of your unmeasured confounders. Okay. Then in a recent paper, we introduced the following condition that in fact, if the heterogeneity in the causal effect due to U is orthogonal to the share, the heterogeneity in the share of compliers among the nudge-able, driven by U, if it's orthogonal, then in fact, the Wald estimand recovers the nudge, the nudge average treatment effect. This condition essentially states that among nudge-able units, any heterogeneity in the treatment effect induced by U is uncorrelated with variability in the share of compliers related to U. This is somewhat similar to one of the conditions, the additive condition where we had no common effect heterogeneity, common effect modifiers, except that this is involving two very different quantities. These are quantities that capture the heterogeneity in causal effect as a function of the unmeasured confounder versus the proportion of individuals who, among the nudge-able, who might be compliers. So what we established, therefore, is that the NATE is uniquely identified by the Wald ratio under IV1 through IV3, and this new assumption IV4 diamond. It's instructive to consider the following somewhat stronger condition, but I would argue easily interpretable sufficient condition for IV4 diamond, which we refer to as a balanced compliers share condition. And that is conditional being nudge-able the share of compliers is balanced with respect to U. And that would in fact imply that the probability that you're a complier, given that you're nudgeable as a function of U, is a constant. So this basically says that the proportion of compliers across labels of the unmeasured confounder doesn't change. But that proportion can be arbitrary. Pi star can be any given number. One way to think about this in terms of treatment, compliance type, confounding of compliance type, is that essentially what matters, the unmeasured confounder confounds whether or not you're going to be a notch-able individuals, whether or not you would respond to the IV. But once you are a person who is nudge-able, it does not further determine whether you're a complier or a defier. And so, as I just said, this condition essentially states that being nudgeable is subject to unmeasured confounding. However, given that a unit is nudgeable, further being a complier versus a defier is unconfounded. It immediately follows that the covariance between the condition I stated before, that this condition 2 is sufficient, in fact, for delta YU and pi U to be uncorrelated, given that pi U would be a constant in this case. And so BCS, balanced compliance share, implies IV4 dagger, but not the converse may not hold. One thing that's particularly interesting about this condition is that it recovers monotonicity as a corner case. Monotonicity just becomes a special case where pi star is 0, in which case the nudgeable are exclusively compliers. And so as far as I'm concerned, if you're willing to rely on monotonicity, there's no reason not to actually make this assumption, because monotonicity will be a special case of this assumption. Crucially, IV diamond may hold even if monotonicity fails, as in the case of BCS. This suggests that one may not need to rely on monotonicity in practice to interpret the Wald ratio as innate, as BCS or the milder condition IV diamond can be viewed as a relaxation of monotonicity while preserving a meaningful interpretation of the Wald ratio. I should also mention here that there has been quite a bit of work in relaxing monotonicity, and mention maybe a couple of such papers in the econometrics literature in the underlying papers. Some of them require moving away from the Wald. Some of them require restricting the outcome model. As far as I know, none of those methods actually preserve those two aspects. As I said, that's my goal here. I'm only worried about the Wald ratio being interpretable, and I do not want to touch the outcome model. And so here are a set of sufficient conditions in which both can be attained, and the causal effect can still be interpreted as a causal effect for a given subpopulation. Another interesting case where IV4 diamond holds without ruling out latent heterogeneity is in either delta YU or pi U, as if in fact both functions depend on some component of U and those components are independent of each other. It's important to note, however, that this is not without limitations. Similar to the late, it's not possible to identify the notch-able individuals, and therefore one does not know the units for whom the NATE is relevant. While under IV4, monotonicity, that is monotonicity, one can learn the proportion of compliers. It does not appear possible to learn the proportion of compliers, defiers, or notch-able units under this weaker IV4 dagger condition, or even the stronger condition BCS. However, it's possible to simply build Fisher-Houghton bounds for those proportions, and we recommend actually doing some reporting them. Oops. So let me sorry about that. Let me summarize where we are now. We have that the Wald ratio estimand has different interpretation under IV1 through IV3, and 1/4 assumption, either monotonicity, you get the late, or no current treatment value interaction, you get the ETT, or multiplicative IV, you again recover the ETT, or IV4 dash, which is no common effect modifier, and the Wald ratio is the ATE. And now we have IV4 diamond, and the Wald ratio is the notch average effect. Again, it's important. The important advantage is that one computes a single number. Different interpretation that you get now obtained depending on the nature of heterogeneity in the treatment assignment mechanism, which model is more credible is in the eye of the investigator. All right, so I'm going to maybe stop there again to see if there are any questions before I shift gears again.
Hi, Eric. Thank you for asking. We don't have more new questions for this part, so we can proceed.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think I'll even end up on time. So we'll now consider, I'm going to move away from the traditional Wald, and I'm going to discuss two generalizations of the Wald. The first one is essentially trying to target, rather than a causal effect on the additive scale, target the counterfactual, any function of the counterfactual distribution in one arm. So this will allow you, for instance, to identify the quantile causal effects. And so what we'll consider is a variant of the Wald ratio. So I call it the generalized Wald ratio estimand. And this very much looks like the Wald ratio, except I've replaced Y with indicator that we're in arm little a, and therefore it's indexed by little a. And the indicator that Y is less or equal to little y, that's indexed by little y. And I'm interested in this because I want to show that if you can identify, this would identify under certain condition the CDF of the potential outcome, in which case you can identify any smooth functional of the CDF. So this is sufficient to demonstrate that. And so that would lead you to identify any of these causal effects under the various assumptions, as I will establish, provided that causal effect will in principle be identified under unconfoundedness. Okay. And so the first thing I want to point out is that Emmons and Rubin in 97 actually showed that under IV4, that is monotonicity or no-defier, that the generalized Wald ratio actually identifies the distribution of Y, the counterfactual Y little a, among the compliers. And so not just the average when affecting the compliers, but actually the entire distribution. And therefore, in principle, one could use this to identify any functional. In the paper with Limbo, we established that under the stronger condition, IV dash, I think this should say B maybe, not A, that the additive effect of Z on A, condition on U is independent of U. Then the generalized Wald given here identifies the distribution of the counterfactual Y little a in the entire population. And so again, we move away from identifying the average human effect on the additive scale to identify the entire CDF, and therefore we can identify any functional of the potential outcome of interest, including quantile causal effects. Recently, in this recent paper I mentioned earlier, we established that under the balanced compliance share condition, then the generalized Wald ratio would in fact identify the potential outcome distribution on the no treatment among the nudge-able individuals. That is, identify the treatment-free counterfactual distribution in the nudge-able. This implies that essentially any smooth counterfactual functional, example, counterfactual quantile, is identified by the generalized Wald for a given subpopulation, provided the corresponding identifying condition holds. For example, one could solve this moment equation to identify the median counterfactual either on the monotonicity or you again get one number under monotonicity or under BCS. You will get the corresponding interpretation of the CDF or of the median that you identified. All right. We've recently established an analogous result for ATT estimates, mainly continue to assume IV1 and IV3. That is IV relevance and exclusion restriction. However, we require a weaker condition of IV2, that is IV independence assumption and latent ignorability. And that replaces this strong latent ignorability. And what I want you to pay attention here is that this requires for both counterfactual, A equals 1 and A equals 0, while in fact it's enough to just require for A equals 0. And I'll come back to this in a second because typically, one would think this doesn't make a difference, but it actually does in this case. And so under IV1, IV2, IV3, and this modified IV2 dagger condition, together with IV4 dagger, which is the multiple IV model, with respect to U, given above, so the U that satisfies this condition, then the generalized Wald ratio estimate identifies a treatment-free counterfactual distribution in the treated. Note here that a standard consensus assumption would identify the same distribution for Y1 in the treated, and therefore would identify any contrast or any functional of both. All right, so let me try to wrap up with this last section. This is the last few slides. This is now moving to a different setting again. What we're going to consider is we're still going to work with the same set of conditions, and we'll demonstrate that in fact under certain conditions one can relax the exclusion restriction and preserve non-parametric identification of a causal effect. So as I just said before, we can identify any ATT function that would in principle be identified under confoundedness by the generalized Wald ratio estimand under strictly weaker conditions than stated in the Hernan and Robbins 06 paper. And what I'm referring to that here is basically we replace, this is the assumption they required in that paper, and we can replace it with this condition, and we still get an identification. My understanding of that is, although they require stronger assumptions, they were interested in a slightly different result. They wanted to show that the Wald ratio, the original Wald ratio, can be interpreted as the ATT, and they require this assumption in order to show that. They required a stronger IV2 condition. And the IV2 dagger condition does not provide that identification result. However, the IV2 dagger condition provides identification of the ETT, but that identification is using the one single arm Wald estimand. So this particular Wald estimand. Okay, the traditional Wald estimand under IV2 dagger will not give you identification. All right, and so why is this important? The above observation actually suggests that the Hernan and Robbins model, 2006 model, actually corresponding to IV1, 2, 3, and the multiplicative IV model is actually not saturated. It imposes a restriction on the observed data, and therefore may include more restrictions than strictly needed to identify the ATT. And this is bad news, but also good news, because that means you actually have an extra degree of freedom in that model. And so what we're going to do with that extra degree of freedom is we're going to relax one of the other IV conditions. We're going to relax IV3, the exclusion restriction. And so upon making this observation, one can saturate the model by relaxing IV3 dagger, the exclusion restriction, by this following assumption that the direct effect of Z on Y, YA equals 0, is monotone in U, is independent of U, and I'll restate this in a second in a more interpretable way, which clearly is implied by the stronger exclusion restriction, but does not imply the latter. This is much weaker. This allows for Z to affect the counterfactual outcomes, so therefore exclusion restriction, but says that the effect cannot depend on the unmeasured confounding. So much substantially weaker restriction than the exclusion restriction. And what we've essentially shown is that you can modify under this set of conditions, so IV1, IV2, IV3 dagger, and the multiplicative IV model, IV4 dagger, you modify the Wald ratio by basically debiasing the numerator by identifying the causal effect of Z on Y, but you have to do so in the treated arm. So you regress Y on Z in the treatment arm, you estimate the effect of Z on Y in the treatment arm, and you simply remove that effect from the reduced form that appears in the numerator, and that would in fact correct for an exclusion restriction violation. Intuitively, the conjunction of these four assumptions essentially implies that you're allowing for a structural model for the outcome that looks like this, where this is really important. The causal effect is unrestricted function of the unmeasured confounder, and we're now allowing for a direct effect of Z on the outcome. So beta UZ has a structure that's additive. We don't allow for U to interact with Z. As far as I know, that's not identified. These assumptions, in fact, imply that Z remains independent of U in the treated. Now, folks who are familiar with DAG will worry that this seems like a crazy assumption, because we know to worry about collider stratification bias. We know Z and U are independent population. How is it that they could be independent in the treated? But it turns out that the multiplicative model and the population dependence assumption imply this condition, which means that you can learn about the effect of Z on Y in the treated, because it's not confounded. and it's not subject to collider stratification biases. So that's basically all that's going on, that beta Z, the exclusion restriction violation, can be captured by estimating the association between Z and Y among the treated. And this would imply identification of the direct effect of Z on Y, which can be removed from the numerator of the Wald estimand. All right, so let me close here. The canonical binary IV model is a simple setting, yet is incredibly rich and an interesting playground for thinking about identification. The Wald ratio estimand and its variance continue to play a central role in the IV literature, and particularly in the use of IVs. I mean, this is probably using two-stage D-squares is the most widely used technique for identifying causal effects. And the purpose of this exercise is to allow investigators to reason about what causal interpretation they might provide to that causal effect. Again, I'm not arguing against constructing bounds and doing everything else that people do to move away from point identification. We're simply providing additional tools to help people reason about what they're doing, which is estimating causal effects and trying to interpret them. The entire talk ignores baseline covariates. Such covariates can readily be incorporated, in which case the causal effects that I've discussed would become a weighted average of the covariate-specific Wald ratio. And this weight will depend on whether you're targeting the late, the ATT, the AT, and the NAT, and which means that once you have covariates, you're no longer just estimating one quantity. These estimate will be different, and they have different challenges. Fortunately, these marginal causal effects, although they're no longer the same statistical estimate, that actually leads to interesting statistics problems. Those of you interested in semi-hierarchical efficiency theory, the advent of double and multiple robust estimators or name-it orthogonal estimators is very feasible in this space for the various estimate, but that's a matter for another talk. The last thing that I didn't discuss today is SSE analysis and bounds to probe various forms of IV4 conditions. And I think that could be far more informative than the typical overly pessimistic IV bounds. To anchor your estimate as the most likely IV identification condition and to increase your bounds from that perspective, as opposed to starting from the, assuming that nature is incredibly adversarial, starting from the unstructured bounds. Let me maybe stop there. The last thing I want to say, this work benefited from astounding collaborators over the years, including trainees and colleagues. And I'm not going to read the list, but these are some, I think, most of the folks who have been involved in this line of research of mine. And I'm incredibly grateful for their collaboration. And this work was funded by the NIH. So we have maybe about 8 minutes or so for discussion. And so maybe I can stop there. Thank you.
Thanks for the amazing talk. Yeah, I think before we go to the discussion, I think Ying has another question from Q&A.
Yes. We have a question on the Freshev-Hofding bounds in an earlier slide. The question is, how does it help in identification of the NATE, or is this partial identification, or is the interpretation of the bound derivation different?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So note that this is not about the causal effect. This is about even if you're willing to make this assumption IV4 diamond, whereby the NAT is identified, the proportion of compliers, the proportion of knowledgeable individuals is not identified. And so this is about bounding that proportion of compliers. And so these are nonparametric bounds that rely on no other assumption than that. I believe we only use consistency and maybe a causal IV to construct these bounds. So that's it. So whereas if you had monotonicity, these bounds would become sharp, and the proportional compliance would just recover the first stage. That is no longer true once you relax monotonicity.
Awesome, thank you. So we're going to stop the recording now. And yeah, for anyone in the audience, if you have a question, if you want to join a discussion, raise your hand and we're going to unmute you.